It's Maundy Thursday, and I want to tell you a story. A story about a countryman of mine. If you've never been able to place the last name Fodor, I'll tell you where I'm from, or at least my ancestry hails from. My ancestry hails from Hungary, that country in Central Europe. And I want to tell you a story about a countryman of mine, Semmelweis. Who's Ignaz Semmelweis? I'm glad you asked. Ignaz Semmelweis was born in 1818. And he grew up in a moment of incredible change. He initially thought he would like to be an attorney, but he was studying in Vienna, and it turned out their law school wasn't as good as their medical school, and so he opted to go to medical school instead. And he did what all good students do, all good want-to-be surgeons did. He did lots of research, but then he also was involved in actual medical practice. And so in the morning, he would be doing much work down in the morgue, doing autopsies and beginning to understand what might have been going wrong with those that died, kind of the pathology of what might have happened. And then in the afternoon, he would take his turn in his first term was in obstetrics, and he would be involved in delivering babies. He realized an anomaly, that there were two wards, that there was a ward where mothers were delivering with doctors, and there was a ward where babies were delivered by midwives. And there was a extremely high mortality rate in the ward that the doctors were serving, whereas the midwives had a very low mortality rate. About 2 in 100 mothers died, where in the context of the doctors, about 30 or 40 in 100 died. This bothered Semmelweis. He couldn't quite figure out why this was the case, why medical professionals were causing more deaths, or why deaths were caused in those cases. And so Semmelweis started thinking long about it. And each time he heard a bell rung on his ward, that would mean a priest was coming. A priest was coming to say last rites. And this troubled him very much. And so he started thinking about what could cause this fever that was killing off all these mothers. And then it dawned on him that in the first part of the day, he was surrounded by death. And that in the second part of the day, he came to be involved with life. And he wondered if somehow, if the death weren't somehow afflicting the life. And he started pondering. He said, what if these, he called them corpse particles, what if somehow corpse particles were being brought from the moment of death into this very moment of life, and that weren't happening to cause this problem? And so he decided to do some research, and he created a situation where he says, well, what if I could wash my hands from these death particles? And he smelled his hands. The only way he could figure out to wash was, this is of course a time before bacteria or viruses had been discovered. They hadn't really figured all this stuff out, but he figured out that there might have been these death particles that were on his hands, and maybe that was the thing contaminating women. So he got this bleach substance. He'd wash his hands, and he did some studies, and he found that when he washed his hands between working in the morgue in the morning and then delivering babies in the afternoon, the mortality rate went way down, right to the level of the midwives. And he realized at that moment that somehow the washing of hands was so essential. I heard this story recently on one of my favorite podcasts, Radio Lab, and it struck me that on Maundy Thursday, this might be the story to share with you all. Maundy Thursday is a reminder for us of what real life looks like. A life of service. A life where we think about others before we think about ourselves. And of course, Jesus teaches us to wash the feet of others through an act of service. And I think that this story about the way in which we often walk through life in very much death-dealing ways, with death particles or corpse particles sticking to our bodies, is somehow the way in which we walk through life in selfish ways and in self-serving ways. And on Maundy Thursday, Jesus not only washes our feet, but tells us to wash our hands. Wash our hands that we might think of those who we serve. We might think about others before we think even about ourselves. Our Lord takes for his sign of authority a towel, soap and a towel to wash. I wonder if this isn't the moment during this anxiety-producing time that we might not too take up the soap, the basin, and the towel as a means of service to our community, as a means of showing our love for those around us. So on this Maundy Thursday, I encourage you to follow the example of my countryman Ignaz Semmelweis and our Lord Jesus Christ, and to pay attention to the life-giving ways that we can engage when we follow in the pattern of love that Jesus shows for us, the pattern that charts the way to what happens just on the horizon on the other side of Good Friday, where we find the power of the resurrection and we find the power of new life.